The bullet had torn through Victor Cavendish's chest at exactly 12:07 a.m. Clean, precise, final. By 12:09 the body was already cooling, the scent of gunpowder fading into the heady mix of whiskey and smoke that clung to the walls of the Sapphire Club. But the real crime, that had started long before the trigger was ever pulled, and as Agatha Marple stepped into the dimly lit salon, she knew one thing for certain: someone in this room had orchestrated it all. The game wasn't over, it was just beginning. A heavy rain washed over the uneven cobblestones of Maple Street, each droplet shimmering under the glow of gas lamps, while the creeping fog curled into the narrow alleyways like a living thing. The old brick buildings stood solemn, their facades worn with age, their shadows deepened by the dim flickering lights. Somewhere in the distance the soft notes of a saxophone drifted through the damp air, blending seamlessly with the quiet pulse of the city. But tonight, that pulse felt off, unsteady, restless, charged with an unspoken tension. Detective Agatha Maru stepped out of a sleek black hansom cab, her petite frame dwarfed by the fog that clung to the streets like a shroud. Her sharp, observant gaze swept across the scene before her, the glowing neon sign of the Crimson Note, casting a crimson reflection onto the rain-slick pavement. It was here that Lionel Cavendish's journey had met an abrupt and untimely end. Adjusting the collar of her long coat, she stepped forward with purpose, her heels clicking against the wet stone as she entered the establishment. Inside, the world changed. The air was thick with the scent of aged whiskey, lingering cigar smoke, and something else, an underlying unease, as if the very walls knew of the secrets hidden within them. Mahogany-paneled walls gleamed under the dim glow of brass sconces, their reflections casting long flickering shadows. A long bar stretched across one side, polished to a mirror-like sheen, but the mood was wrong. There was no lively chatter, no clinking of glasses, only hushed murmurs and stolen glances. A few patrons huddled near the entrance, whispering, while the staff stood unnaturally still, their eyes flicking toward the bar where Cavendish had been found. Agatha approached the bartender, a broad-shouldered man with a ruddy complexion and nervous hands fumbling with a glass. "You found the body?" she asked, her voice measured and calm. The bartender paled slightly, his grip tightening around the glass. "Yes, ma'am," he stammered. "Slumped over the bar. Found him this morning when I opened up. Didn't see no one leave, but well, folks come and go all night. Not all of 'em use the front door, if you catch my meaning." Agatha's keen eyes swept across the bar, noting every detail. Everything seemed immaculate, too immaculate. Every surface gleamed, except for a single faintly darkened spot on the polished wood, barely perceptible but unmistakable. Blood had seeped into the grain here, but there was something else, something beyond the bar itself. Her gaze shifted to a corner of the room where a section of the wall didn't sit quite right, as if it had been disturbed. She reached into her glove, retrieving a small pin, and carefully slid it along the barely visible seam. A quiet click sounded, and the hidden panel eased open. A passage. The air beyond was different, cooler, heavier, tinged with the scent of damp earth and aged wood. She stepped inside, descending a narrow staircase that groaned under her careful tread. Her torchlight flickered against stacks of crates and barrels, their faded labels hinting at foreign origins. Smuggled spirits, untouched except for one section where the dust had been recently disturbed. She crouched, running her gloved fingers along the edge of a crate. Something had been moved, someone had been here, recently, but why, and what had they taken? When she emerged back into the main room, the atmosphere had shifted. The bartender had stopped his nervous rambling. The gathered officers watched her intently. She pulled off her leather gloves with deliberate ease, and let her sharp gaze sweep across the room once more. "There's more to this place than meets the eye," she murmured, smoothing the hidden panel shut. "Now tell me, who had the most to lose if Lionel Cavendish was no longer playing his part?" A charged silence followed. The question hung in the air, lingering like the final notes of a jazz melody, unresolved, waiting for the truth to break free. Someone in this room knew the answer, and sooner or later, they would have to speak. The dim glow of the Crimson Notes chandeliers cast long fractured shadows across the room, their light flickering against the deep red drapes that seemed to swallow sound and air alike. The place, once an indulgent escape, now felt more like a gilded prison, its velvet corners too dark, its silence too rehearsed. The air carried the weight of unspoken truths, thick and heavy, settling into the very fabric of the room. But Agatha Maru wasn't fooled by the opulence, nor by the practiced nonchalance of those within. Her mind remained fixed on the hidden passage she had uncovered, the damp chill of its air, the unmistakable signs of recent movement. It had been used, and recently, a secret escape, a smuggler's route, or something far more insidious. She turned back to the gathered patrons, her expression unreadable. "Oh," she said, lightly, as if making idle conversation, "I'd like a word with each of you, one at a time, if you don't mind." The bartender was first, a broad man with trembling hands that fumbled with a glass he had already wiped clean a dozen times. His voice came in quick, uneven bursts as he recounted his discovery of Cavendish's body, his sentences tumbling over each other in his rush to be done with it. "He was fine, I swear. Happy even. No trouble at all." But when Agatha's sharp gaze flicked toward him, his fingers tightened around the rag. "I never knew about no passage," he stammered, his voice cracking slightly. "Been here 3 years. Never seen it before." A lie. Or was the fear in his eyes real? Next came the singer, a statuesque woman draped in a midnight blue sequined gown that caught the candlelight like a cascade of broken stars. She swirled her drink absent-mindedly, the ice clinking against the glass as she regarded Agatha with a half-lidded gaze. "Cavendish," she mused, a slow, hollow laugh escaping her lips. "He had a way about him, didn't he? Always got what he wanted." Her eyes flickered, unreadable, as she lifted her glass, then set it down untouched. "He made too many promises, to too many people." The words were soft, but the steel beneath them was unmistakable. The manager followed, a wiry man with shifting eyes, and a face that refused to settle into a single expression. His fingers twitched as he spoke, his gaze darting toward the door. "I don't meddle in business that ain't mine," he muttered, licking his lips. "Cavendish was good for the place, sure, but I don't know who'd want him dead. I just keep things running smooth, that's all." But Agatha was already piecing together the fragments. The bartender's nervous hands, the singer's resentment, the manager's evasiveness, they were all threads, tangled and twisted around the truth. And yet, none of them admitted to knowing about the passage, their denials quick, almost rehearsed. But she felt it, the tension beneath their words, the presence of something unspoken, just out of reach. The melancholy strains of the house band drifted through the club, winding their way through the charged silence that followed her final question. She let the music settle around her, absorbing the weight of the moment, then, with no more answers to extract, she stepped out into the night. The air outside was sharp with the scent of rain and cobblestone, the flickering gas lamps casting pools of golden light onto the wet pavement. For a moment, Agatha simply stood there, inhaling deeply, letting the cold clear her thoughts. Then, movement, a flicker at the edge of her vision, a shadow at the far end of the street, quick and deliberate, slipping into the mist. She didn't hesitate. With one last glance at the club behind her, Agatha Maru adjusted her coat, steadied her breath, and followed. The narrow streets of Maple Street lay cloaked in a shroud of damp fog, the gas lamps casting flickering halos on the glistening cobblestones. Detective Agatha Maru moved with practiced precision, her keen eyes absorbing every shadow that shifted beneath the glow of the city's restless pulse. The scent of rain-soaked pavement, mixed with the distant murmur of a jazz band, spilling through the cracks of a clandestine speakeasy's door. But tonight, the city's melody was off-key. There was something in the air, a tension, a secret just waiting to be unearthed. She tightened her scarf against the chill as she neared the Midnight Lily, an establishment notorious for the illicit dealings hidden beneath its polished mahogany and golden chandeliers. Inside, the heavy aroma of spilled whiskey and expensive perfume clung to the air, mingling with the hushed conversations of those who preferred their business unseen. The usual warmth of the club had faded, replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional clink of ice against glass. At the far end of the bar, Lionel Cavendish had once commanded attention with his easy charm and deep pockets. Now his absence was more deafening than any presence could be. Agatha moved toward the bar, her gloves brushing against its polished surface, immaculate, save for a single darkened stain near the center, blood. She turned to the bartender, a stout man with a face lined by years of discretion and the weight of unspoken knowledge. "You found him," she stated, her voice level, piercing through the heavy atmosphere. The man nodded, his fingers tightening around the glass he wiped, the cloth trembling ever so slightly. "Slumped over just there, place was locked up tight, didn't see no one come or go, but not everyone uses the front door, if you catch my meaning." Agatha's gaze flicked toward the far wall, a seam barely visible, disrupted the smooth paneling, a hidden passage, purposeful, designed not just for escape, but for secrets. She pressed against it, and with a muted click, the door gave way, revealing a narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air grew thick, damp, carrying the scent of aged wood, and something more elusive, something recently disturbed. She descended, her small flashlight, cutting through the gloom, illuminating stacks of crates marked in foreign script, smuggling. But one area stood apart, barrels displaced, a space where something had been moved, or perhaps taken. Someone had been here, recently, and they had left in a hurry. When she emerged from the passage, the bar's patrons were watching, silent and expectant. Agatha's gaze swept the room, lingering on each face, the bartender, his hands still shaking, the cabaret singer, her sequined gown catching the dim light, her expression unreadable. The club's manager, his watery eyes darting toward the door, as if itching for an escape. "I'd like a word with each of you," she said finally, her tone deceptively light. One at a time, the bartender spoke first, his words tumbling over themselves as he swore he knew nothing of the passage. The singer followed, her voice laced with something between bitterness and amusement. "Cavendish always got what he wanted," she murmured, swirling her drink but never taking a sip, "until he promised too much to too many people." The manager was last, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I run the club, detective, that's all. What happens in the shadows, I don't ask." But Agatha knew better. Shadows had weight, shadows had purpose, and one had just moved beyond the club's door. As she stepped onto the damp street once more, the fog curled around her like a living thing, and just at the far end a figure moved, too quickly to be a wandering passerby. Her pulse quickened. Someone had been listening, someone who had something to hide, and tonight, she intended to find out exactly who. The evening had settled over the city like a velvet cloak, the distant murmur of street life ebbing and flowing beneath the glow of flickering gaslights. Detective Agatha Maru moved through the courthouse's grand halls with quiet determination, the scent of old parchment and lemon polish mingling in the still air. She had spent enough time among liars to recognize the subtle betrayals of the body, the flicker of unease, the pause before a response, the telltale shift of weight that revealed more than words ever could. And District Attorney Lionel Carrington had betrayed himself in more ways than one. His voice had been smooth, his posture poised, but the tightening of his fingers around his ink pen when she mentioned Cavendish's financial records had not escaped her notice. The moment had passed in an instant, but it had been enough. Now she held the ledger in her gloved hands, its thick leather cover worn from years of use. It had taken quiet persuasion and a well-placed favor to secure access, but there it was, a labyrinth of numbers, names, and transactions spanning years, each column a thread waiting to be unraveled. Agatha traced her finger over the ink-stained pages, her sharp gaze catching anomalies that a casual observer might miss. Certain figures stood out, not in their size, but in their timing. Payments logged just before key court cases, sums exchanged between hands before crucial indictments were dismissed. And then there were the initials, small, unassuming yet curiously persistent. A pattern began to emerge, subtle yet undeniable. Some entries bore nothing more than a single letter, L, always appearing on the eve of enforcement crackdowns, always coinciding with the downfall of Cavendish's rivals. Agatha exhaled slowly, tapping the edge of the page. If this ledger was to be believed, Cavendish had not merely been operating under Carrington's watchful eye, he had been protected. And now, with Cavendish dead, the balance had shifted. The question was, had Carrington miscalculated? Or had he played a role in ensuring Cavendish's demise when the arrangement was no longer convenient? The thought simmered as she stepped into the dim-lit corridor, her heels clicking softly against marble. Outside, the fog was thickening, curling around the courthouse steps like restless spirits. She descended with measured strides, her breath a faint mist in the cool night air. The city thrummed beyond the courthouse square, the low murmur of conversation from passing strangers, the occasional burst of laughter from a nearby club where the night was just beginning. Somewhere in the distance, a car idled too long at the curb before easing into motion, its presence too deliberate to be mere coincidence. Someone was watching, someone knew she was close. Agatha's gloved fingers tightened around the ledger. The next move would have to be careful, precise. Because in a city where secrets held more weight than gold, the wrong step could turn the hunter into the hunted. The ledger sat heavy in Agatha Maru's gloved hands, its weight far more than mere paper and ink. It was a weapon, one that had already claimed a life, and if she wasn't careful, might claim another. The scent of old leather mixed with the faint tang of whiskey and smoke that clung to the air of the dimly lit speakeasy. Her sharp eyes traced the meticulous records, names reduced to initials, payments logged with cold precision. These weren't ordinary transactions. Every sum was a thread in a web of corruption, protection money disguised as business dealings, bribes masked as routine expenses. But one thing stood out above all, a pattern. The initials lined up too perfectly with the dates of arrests, sudden crackdowns, and political shifts. Certain figures, powerful figures, had remained untouched while others had been swept away like dust. Someone had been pulling strings, ensuring that some men thrived while others were buried. Cavendish had understood this game, but had he made a fatal mistake? Had he grown too ambitious, believing himself untouchable? Or worse, had he threatened to expose the very system that had once protected him? Agatha's fingers hovered over a set of entries, each one marked with a subtle variance in the ink, a different hand perhaps. A different author in the same book of sins. If Cavendish had been keeping this ledger not as a record, but as insurance, then whoever had killed him hadn't done it just to silence him. They had done it to claim control, and if that was the case, then the real danger had only just begun. A shadow shifted near the entrance, barely perceptible in the low light. Agatha's senses sharpened instantly, but she did not move. Instead she closed the book with deliberate slowness, her every movement calculated. She was being watched. At the far end of the bar, the only other occupant of the room sat in a pool of golden lamplight, the bouncer. A broad-shouldered man whose sheer presence filled the space as much as his size. His face was cut with deep lines, the kind earned through years of hard living. His shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealed the faint pale streak of a scar running down his collarbone, a relic of a past altercation, a silent reminder that he had survived, things most men wouldn't. Agatha stood and made her way toward him. Her footsteps measured, she slid into the chair opposite him, folding her hands lightly in her lap. "You knew Cavendish well," she said without preamble, her voice steady but not unkind. The bouncer exhaled, his fingers tapping once against the table. Well enough, he admitted. Man like that, you don't ask too many questions, you do your job. But you noticed a change, she pressed. Something flickered in his eyes, a hesitation, a memory he hadn't yet decided whether to share. Then finally he nodded. Yeah, he was on edge those last few days. Kept that ledger close, real close. Didn't leave it behind the bar no more, kept it on him at all times. Always checking his back. Agatha studied him, her gaze unwavering. Why? The man shifted, his muscles tensing. Dunno, but he was different. Not just careful, scared. Scared of what? Silence. It stretched between them like a taut wire, vibrating with unspoken truths. Agatha tilted her head slightly, waiting, letting him wrestle with his own reluctance. Then in a voice lower than before, he mumbled. He knew something bad was coming. The air in the room felt heavier, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of the secret hanging between them. Agatha leaned in, just slightly. And who, she whispered, was he afraid of? The bouncer's jaw tightened, his gaze flickering toward the door, toward the shadows that had moved earlier. Outside, the city pulsed with life, unaware that somewhere in its depths, a killer still walked free. The bouncer exhaled slowly, rubbing a broad hand across his jaw, his eyes narrowing as if weighing his words. Hard to say, he muttered, his voice carrying the weariness of a man who had seen too much. Cavendish had arguments, sure. Plenty of folks came through here, and not all of them friendly. But I did hear him, and that cabaret singer, Marlene, going at it one night, after closing. She was furious, shouting about promises, about what he owed her. His fingers tapped the table, a slow, unconscious rhythm. Agatha leaned in slightly, her voice measured. And what exactly did he owe her? The bouncer shrugged, his massive shoulders rolling like shifting stone. Not my business. I just keep the peace. But Agatha wasn't fooled by the dismissal. She let the silence stretch just long enough to invite further thought. After a pause, she continued, her tone light but insistent. Did you see anything else unusual? Anyone coming or going who shouldn't have been here? The hesitation was slight, but there, his hands resting on the table, tensed briefly before he answered. There was one thing, he admitted. Red Sullivan, small-time smuggler, moves goods through the back alleys, the tunnels. I saw him slip in here a few nights before Cavendish died, came through the back entrance, quiet as a ghost, didn't speak to nobody, just nodded at Cavendish, and went straight to the office. Didn't stay long, then he was gone. Agatha's expression remained composed, but inwardly she noted the name, another thread in the tangled web, and afterward, she prompted. The bouncer's brow furrowed, his gaze distant, recalling details long buried. Cavendish didn't say much, he admitted, but he was worse after that, jumpy, muttering to himself. Kept that damn ledger even closer than before, like he thought someone might try to rip it out of his hands. He exhaled. It wasn't like him. Cavendish was always cocky, always sure of himself, but those last few days, he was a man who knew something bad was coming. Agatha studied him, her sharp gaze missing nothing, the tension in his jaw, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. She inclined her head slightly. You've been very helpful. She stood, moving back toward the bar where the ledger still lay open under the low golden glow of the overhead lamp. Slowly, deliberately, she flipped through its pages, scanning each line of careful, calculated transactions. Then, near the middle of the book, something caught her eye, small, almost insignificant. A tiny inked star beside a name, Red Sullivan. Agatha traced the marking with her fingertip, her mind assembling the pieces. The careful entries in the ledger weren't just financial records, they were markers of power, roadmaps of influence. Payments lined up too neatly with key arrests, sudden disappearances, and impossible acquittals in Maple Street's courts. Someone had used this ledger as a weapon, moving pieces on a board with the precision of a master strategist. But had Cavendish been the puppet master, or had he been a pawn who finally realized he was trapped? She exhaled, snapping the ledger shut with a crisp motion. The faint echoes of Marlene's anger, the quiet urgency in the bouncer's voice, the cryptic visit from Red Sullivan, all of it twisted together into a knot that only one thing could unravel. She needed to find Sullivan. The streets outside pulsed with life, but Agatha barely noticed. Her mind was already ahead of her, tracing the next move. The trail led to the city's outskirts, where the air grew thick with coal smoke and the scent of damp stone. There, looming like a silent sentinel against the night, stood an old warehouse, its weathered brick walls bearing the scars of time and secrets. A single light flickered behind a partially shuttered window, a dim wavering pulse against the darkness. Someone was inside. Adjusting her gloves, Agatha stepped forward. If Red Sullivan held the key to Cavendish's fate, she intended to pry it from him, one way or another. Agatha moved with practiced silence, her footsteps muffled by the damp earth and scattered debris. The cold night air carried hushed voices from within the warehouse, low urgent tones that sharpened as she crept closer. His mistake, one voice sneered. He thought he was untouchable, thought he was smarter than the rest of us. A rough chuckle followed, bitter and edged with satisfaction. Yeah, well, now he's just another problem wiped clean. A burst of laughter, then the unmistakable scrape of something heavy dragging across the floor. Agatha pressed herself against the weathered brick, heart steady, ears tuned to the dark symphony of whispered conspiracies. I told you we should have handled this sooner. Another voice, sharp with irritation, cut through the murmur. But no, you wanted to wait. Now we've got this mess. Relax, came the response, quieter but laced with menace. We handle it right, and it'll look like the feds botched the whole thing. No one will trace it back. Agatha's fingers brushed against the leather-bound notebook tucked in her coat, instincts warring between staying to listen and moving before the tension inside erupted into something worse. A beam of light slashed the darkness as a door creaked open, footsteps shuffled, then the heavy slam of wood against metal rang out, swallowing the voices in an echoing hush. She exhaled slowly, slipping back into the embrace of the shadows. The night pressed close as she moved away, thoughts threading together, a mistake, a ledger. Secrets buried in ink. The pieces of the puzzle slid into place, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Back at the last note, the cabaret singer lounged in her usual corner, the dim light catching the sequins of her dress like shattered glass. Marlene's fingers curled around the stem of her glass, though the way her hand hovered just above it betrayed an unease she tried to mask beneath a smirk. Her gaze lifted as Agatha approached, the detective's presence understated yet charged with an invisible weight. "Questions, Miss Marple." The words were smooth, but a faint tremor laced the melody of her voice. Agatha didn't waste time. You had an argument with Cavendish the night before he died. Promises, debts. What did he owe you? Marlene's hand stilled, her expression flickering between defiance and something softer. "You've been listening to gossip," she said, voice brittle. "Lionel Cavendish owed plenty of people, detective. What's one more?" Agatha studied her, then leaned in just slightly, the scent of whiskey and fading perfume lingering between them. "Enough to make you angry?" she asked, her voice soft but unrelenting. "Angry enough to end the debt permanently?" A crack in the mask, the shift was subtle, a flicker of the eyes, the way her fingers ghosted over the pearls at her throat. "No," she said, too quickly then quieter. "No, it wasn't like that." Agatha waited, letting silence stretch, heavy and demanding. Finally Marlene exhaled, a thread of resignation woven through it. "Cavendish got greedy," she admitted, voice barely above a whisper, "said he didn't need the DA anymore. He was going to run things his way, cut out the old players, expose everyone who stood in his way." Her lips curled into a humorless smile. "Thought he could be king of Maple Street." Agatha's gaze didn't waver, though inwardly she filed the revelation away. A motive, one that painted a target on Cavendish's back. "And you?" she asked, voice as light as silk, sharp as a blade. "What did you think of his grand plan?" Marlene let out a quiet, mirthless laugh. "What I think doesn't matter," she murmured. "Cavendish always did what he wanted, and look where that got him." The singer lifted her glass and took a slow sip, but her eyes betrayed her, a glint of something unsaid, something buried beneath the bravado. Agatha caught it, held it, but let the moment pass. There were bigger threads to pull, and this was just the beginning. Agatha's gaze remained steady as the cabaret singer's words hung in the air, but before she could press further, the bartender cleared his throat. His hands, rough from years of polishing glasses, trembled slightly as he reached under the counter, producing a small folded note. "I found this after you left last time," he murmured, hesitating before handing it over. "Didn't think much of it, but now..." His voice trailed off, his expression unreadable. Agatha took the note, the edges worn, the paper creased as if it had been turned over in anxious hands. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes narrowing as she read the scrawled, frantic script. "I'm not safe, too many people know. If this goes on, I'll end up like the others. I have to disappear tonight." The weight of the words settled in her mind, clicking into place like the sharp edge of a knife. Lionel Cavendish had been afraid, not just wary, not just cautious, genuinely terrified. He had planned to vanish before someone got to him, and yet he hadn't made it. Someone had ensured that. Agatha's fingers tightened around the paper as she slid it into her coat pocket, her expression unreadable. The cabaret singer's gaze lingered on her, guarded, wary, her lips pressed into a thin line. "It's always the small details," Agatha mused, almost absently. "Wouldn't you agree?" The woman didn't respond, but something flickered across her face, an awareness, a knowledge she wasn't willing to share just yet. Agatha didn't press, not now. Instead she rose from her seat, and turned toward the door, the dim hum of the house band trailing her as she stepped into the cold night air. The city's pulse thrummed around her, distant laughter, the echo of footsteps in alleyways, the ever-present whisper of secrets, unraveling just beneath the surface. Cavendish had been playing a dangerous game, and now, it was Agatha's turn to uncover just how deep the danger ran. She moved swiftly, her thoughts razor-sharp as she made her way back to the hidden passage beneath the old speakeasy, where the real answers lay waiting in the dark. The air grew cooler as she descended the narrow steps, the scent of damp wood and aged whiskey clinging to the walls. Her flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the same stacked crates, the same worn floorboards, except now with a more discerning eye. She saw what she had missed before, a scuffed mark along the edge of the staircase, subtle but fresh, as though someone had stumbled or twisted mid-struggle. Her pulse quickened. She crouched, tracing the disturbance with her fingers. It wasn't deep, but it told a story of haste, of someone moving against resistance. Rising, she swept the light further ahead, past the crates, past the discarded straw that littered the ground, and then she saw it, a metallic glint half buried among the debris. She stepped forward, carefully, and picked it up. A revolver, small, compact. The kind meant for concealment rather than show. She turned it over in her hands, its surface cool from the night air, but the weight of it told a different story. This gun had been used, and recently. The faint scent of gunpowder still clung to the barrel, sharp and acrid against the lingering aroma of whiskey. No blood on the floor, no clear sign of a struggle, just the silent echoes of something that had happened too fast for anyone to fight back. Her breath came slow, measured, her mind already shifting through the implications. Had Cavendish been here? Had he been silenced before he could slip away? If so, by whom? And why had the gun been left behind? A miscalculation, or a message? The pieces were there, scattered like broken glass waiting to be pieced together, and Agatha Marple intended to do just that. The city streets lay cloaked in fog, the dim glow of street lamps, barely piercing through the thick mist that curled around the alleyways like a living thing. Agatha Marple pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her sharp eyes scanning the entrance of Last Note Speakeasy. The night carried a damp chill, but inside she knew the air would be thick with whiskey fumes, secrets, and lies. The kind of place where truth had a price and survival depended on knowing when to pay it. She pushed the door open, stepping into the low humming ambience of the speakeasy. The scent of aged bourbon mixed with the faint traces of perfume, cigarette smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. The piano played in the background, a slow, sultry tune, but there was a tension in the air that even the melody couldn't mask. Agatha's gaze swept the room, her presence unnoticed by most but not by all. The bartender, usually a man with an easy grin and a sharp tongue, was different tonight. He stood behind the counter, hands gripping a glass a little too tightly, his gaze flickering toward her before darting away. Agatha didn't need to ask. Something had changed. Then, almost as if he had been waiting for the right moment, he spoke. "You need to see something," he said, voice lower than usual, as though afraid the walls might be listening. Reaching beneath the counter, he pulled out a worn folded note, its edges crumpled as if someone had held it too tightly in shaking hands. Agatha took it, her pulse steady, but her mind already working ahead. She unfolded the note carefully, and as her eyes traced the frantic scrawl, the weight of its words settled over her like a cold hand on her spine. "I am not safe. Too many people know. If this continues, I will end up like the others. I have to disappear tonight." The signature was absent, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Cavendish. She read it again, slower this time, letting each word sink in. Cavendish had been afraid. Cavendish had been planning to run. And yet, someone had made sure he never got the chance. Agatha folded the note with deliberate precision and slipped it into her pocket. Her gaze flicked toward the cabaret singer in the corner, a woman with sultry eyes and a knowing silence. The sequins on her dress caught the dim light, but her expression remained carefully blank. Agatha offered her a small, unreadable smile before turning away. It was always the small details that unraveled everything. Outside, the city breathed in the cold night air, fog rolling in from the docks like creeping fingers reaching for the unsuspecting. Agatha stood for a moment, her mind weaving together the pieces. Cavendish had wanted to disappear, but had someone decided to disappear him first? If so, that meant this wasn't just a murder, it was a game where someone had anticipated his every move, and made sure he never got another. She moved with purpose toward the hidden passage beneath Last Note. The air grew damp as she descended the wooden staircase, the sound of her own footsteps muffled by years of dust and secrecy. Her torch beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating crates of contraband whiskey stacked high against the walls. Everything seemed as it had before, but now, her eyes were sharper. She knew what to look for. Halfway down, she noticed them. Scuff marks, faint, but fresh. Someone had moved hastily here, dragged a heel, twisted under resistance, the kind of thing most would overlook, but to Agatha, it told an entire story. Someone had struggled here, Cavendish, or his killer. Then something else, a glint in the straw. She crouched, brushing away the scattered debris. A revolver, small, still warm. The faint scent of gunpowder clung to it, sharp beneath the musk of aged whiskey. Recently fired, recently discarded. She held it at arm's length, turning it carefully in her hands. This was no relic, no long-forgotten weapon, it was evidence. The killer hadn't just left it behind. They wanted it to be found. Back inside the Last Note's grand salon, the atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer just a speakeasy, it was now a stage, and everyone in it was playing a part. The cabaret singer stood near the bar, her sequins catching the candlelight. The bartender, his large hands clasped too tightly in front of him, refused to meet her gaze. The manager, pale and fidgeting, lingered by the door as if considering escape. And at the far end of the room, District Attorney Charles Elton, the man with the most carefully crafted mask. But even he wasn't flawless. Agatha stepped forward, her small frame commanding more weight than her size suggested. When she spoke, the air itself seemed to still. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice smooth yet sharp, "we have all been affected by the tragedy of Lionel Cavendish. We have heard many versions of the truth, some closer to it than others, but one fact has been evident from the beginning. This was no crime of passion, this was premeditated." A flicker of tension passed through the room, subtle, but there. She let the silence stretch, watching their reactions. Cavendish had been playing a dangerous game, but someone had decided to rewrite the rules, and now they were trapped in a game of her making. Her fingers tapped against her coat pocket, where the revolver rested, now wrapped carefully in a handkerchief. She knew the truth was close, and once she had it, there would be no escape. The heavy silence of the last note speakeasy was thick enough to choke on. Shadows stretched long across the grand salon, where the city's most carefully concealed secrets were now unraveling in a single, inescapable moment. The scent of aged bourbon, damp velvet, and the faint metallic tang of fear lingered in the air, mixing with the distant hum of the city outside. Yet within these walls, time had stopped. No one breathed, no one moved. Agatha Marple stood at the center of it all, a small yet unshakable force, her sharp green eyes glinting like polished glass as she studied the faces around her. Each of them had played their part in the game, some knowingly, some unwittingly, but only one had orchestrated the ending, and she was here to rewrite it. The manager stood stiffly near the bar, his face pale, his mouth opening as if to speak, yet no sound emerged. Behind him, Lond, ever the quiet observer, leaned against the counter with his arms folded, his expression unreadable, except for the slight tension in his jaw, a detail small enough to miss. But Agatha missed nothing. "You see," she said smoothly, stepping forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "Cavendish's greatest mistake was never his arrogance, though he had that in spades. His mistake was thinking he was untouchable, and he believed that because of one thing, his ledger." A flicker of recognition passed through the room, barely perceptible, but it was there. She had them now. "It was his weapon," she continued, her voice unwavering. "He used it to manipulate, to control, to hold power over the very people who thought they could control him. It was his protection, but it was also his downfall." Her gaze locked onto District Attorney Charles Elton, his carefully crafted composure beginning to crack at the edges. His fingers twitched, his shoulders stiffened. "It is no secret," she went on, her tone now edged with steel, "that certain officials allowed Cavendish's operations to continue. Favors were exchanged, protection was granted, and none of it was cheap. But that ledger, if it had surfaced, it would have burned more than just Cavendish." A sharp intake of breath, averted eyes, someone shifting uncomfortably in the dim candlelight. Agatha let the weight of her words settle. Then she turned on Elton, her voice dropping lower, deadlier. "No one knew that better than you, Mr. Elton." The tension snapped. He exhaled sharply, his hands clenching at his sides. A flicker of something between defiance and dread flashed in his eyes. He opened his mouth to protest, but Agatha raised a single hand, cutting him off effortlessly. "Not another word, Mr. Elton. Silence. You let Cavendish operate, not because you were corrupt, though that remains debatable, but because he had leverage over you. You needed to keep your secrets buried, and he knew it. You were desperate to silence him, but—" She paused, tilting her head ever so slightly. "You are not the killer." A ripple of shock coursed through the room. The cabaret singer gasped softly, the bartender's grip on the counter tightened, the manager's already pale complexion drained of all remaining color. Agatha turned her attention elsewhere now. "No," she continued, her words measured. The killer is someone who had even more to lose. She took a slow, deliberate step forward, her sharp gaze now locked onto the manager. Someone who couldn't afford for that ledger to be exposed. Someone who didn't just want Cavendish dead, they needed it. The manager flinched, a small movement, but one that spoke volumes. You knew that if that ledger surfaced, it wouldn't just end Cavendish. Agatha's voice was quieter now, but it cut deeper. It would have ended the entire operation. The room pressed in on itself, the weight of the moment crushing down like a storm waiting to break. Your operation. The final word landed like a gunshot. The manager stumbled back a step, shaking his head, his breath coming fast and shallow, his lips parted, but his voice had abandoned him. You killed Cavendish, Agatha said, stepping closer, and you made sure it looked like a gang hit, a convenient, clean little tragedy. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. You thought you could destroy the ledger before anyone found it, she continued, her tone softer now, almost pitying. But you made one mistake. She took another step forward, closing the distance between them, her voice dropping to a near whisper. You underestimated me. And just like that, the manager shattered. His legs buckled, and he collapsed into the nearest chair, his head falling into his trembling hands. The silence that followed was deafening. Somewhere across the room, someone exhaled. A shoe scuffed against the carpet. A glass was set down with a quiet clink. Agatha turned back to Elton, her expression unreadable. You may be complicit, Mr. Elton. Her voice was calm again, almost casual, but you are not guilty of murder. Elton said nothing, his mouth pressed into a thin line. His face was ashen, yet relieved. Agatha cast a glance toward the cabaret singer and the bartender, both of whom stood frozen in stunned silence. Then she stepped back into the center of the room, taking one final look at the wreckage left in the wake of her truth. It always comes down to power, she murmured, more to herself than to anyone else. And those who will do anything to keep it. The weight of her words lingered as the manager's broken, gasping protests filled the space, his voice cracking against the heavy velvet walls of the last note. But it didn't matter, it was over. The manager's breath hitched as he stumbled back, his gaze flickering toward the exit like a cornered animal. The weight of the room seemed to press down on him, the dim glow of the chandeliers casting jagged shadows across his face. Around him, the air was thick with unspoken words, the ghosts of secrets clawing to be set free. Agatha stood poised, her expression unreadable, her sharp eyes fixed on him with an unrelenting calm. She did not flinch as the manager's voice rose in desperation, cracking under the pressure. His hands trembled, fists clenching and unclenching as he lashed out, grasping for an escape that no longer existed. "This is madness," he spat, his voice raw. "You're making a mistake, letting the real murderer go free. That ledger, it's just numbers, nothing more, a list of deals, of debts, of meaningless transactions." Agatha tilted her head ever so slightly, her gloved fingers clasped neatly in front of her. The silence that followed was suffocating. "A ledger," she finally murmured, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel, "is never just numbers. It's a blueprint of power, a map of betrayal." The manager's lips parted, but no words came. A bead of sweat slid down his temple. "It tells a story, Mr. Stratton." Her words were deliberate, each syllable laced with quiet precision. "A story you've been trying very hard to bury." The bartender had stopped polishing his glass, his fingers frozen around the rim. The cabaret singer, once poised and indifferent, now stood rigid against the wall, arms crossed, her crimson lips pursed as she studied the scene unfold. Even Elton, the seasoned district attorney, had paled, his carefully honed composure finally beginning to crack. The manager laughed, short and sharp, but it was a hollow, broken sound. "I don't know what you're talking about." But the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Agatha took a measured step forward, her gaze never leaving him. "You do." A flicker of something, fear, recognition, crossed his face, the missing entry. Silence. Agatha's voice remained calm, but the weight of it was crushing. Cavendish tried to erase it himself, to rip out the page before anyone could find it. Because that payment was damning, wasn't it? The bartender exhaled sharply. The cabaret singer's nails dug into her sleeve. A payment you made, Mr. Stratton. The room seemed to tilt. A payment made to ensure your own survival. The manager's chest rose and fell in uneven gasps, his gaze darting to the bar, to the far door, anywhere but at Agatha. Cavendish protected you, she pressed on, the quiet intensity of her voice more powerful than any accusation. Until he didn't. Until he decided he no longer needed you. Until he realized you were a liability. The words landed like hammer blows. And when he threatened to expose you, when he made it clear that you were expendable, you panicked. The room closed in around him. You saw the only way out. You used the secret passage. You planted the weapon. You staged the crime to look like a gang hit, hoping the chaos would bury the truth forever. For a fleeting second, the manager's eyes burned with defiance, but it crumbled just as quickly. His knees buckled, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of the truth had finally broken him. Agatha did not look away. It almost worked. The final blow. He collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands. He didn't ask what his mistake was. He already knew. The scuff mark on the stairs. The revolver, carelessly discarded. The missing page in the ledger, torn but not destroyed. The truth had unraveled, thread by thread, and now it lay bare before them all. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the distant hum of the city beyond the thick velvet curtains, and then the wail of sirens. Within minutes the doors burst open, the presence of uniformed officers severing the last of the speakeasy's fragile illusions. The manager was pulled to his feet, his protests now reduced to a low, muttered denial. The ledger, the damning, inescapable proof of everything, was seized, its secrets finally free from the shadows. Agatha stood by the bar, unmoving, as the room slowly exhaled. The cabaret singer slipped away through the side door, vanishing into the night without a word. The bartender began stacking glasses once more, his movements slow, deliberate. Elton hesitated, his gaze lingering on Agatha for a fraction of a second before he turned and left. And just like that, Maple Street began to breathe again. Outside, the jazz band struck up a tune, its low, mournful notes winding through the air as if the night had never been disturbed. As if the world would simply continue turning, brushing past its ghosts without a second glance. Agatha adjusted her gloves, picked up her handbag, and cast one last look at the grand salon. The mystery was over. The truth had surfaced. But Maple Street, it would never truly sleep. Not in a place where secrets were currency and shadows had eyes. And in that moment, Agatha Marple knew one thing for certain: the night was quiet. But it would not stay that way for long. Dawn crept over Maple Street, like a slow confession, peeling away the layers of night, but failing to wash away the stains of the past. The street, caught between waking and dreaming, seemed almost reluctant to stir, its storefronts still wrapped in shadow, its alleyways holding tight to secrets whispered under the cover of darkness. The usual hum of city life was absent, as if the weight of the truth had momentarily silenced even the restless heartbeat of Maple Street. Agatha sat alone on a worn wooden bench at the far end of the street, the ledger resting heavily in her lap. The pages, yellowed and frayed at the edges, held more than numbers. They held a history written in debt and betrayal, in whispered deals and unspoken threats. She had read through it again in the long, sleepless hours, her fingers tracing the damning entries, the careful cover-ups, the shifting tides of power that had shaped the district in ways unseen by its everyday inhabitants. Every name was a thread in the city's web, every payment a tether pulling someone deeper into the dark. She exhaled slowly, placing her gloves beside her. The choice before her was no longer about guilt or innocence, it was about consequences. If she exposed what she knew, The balance of power that had kept Maple Street's corruption contained would shatter, unraveling decades of carefully maintained control. The district attorney would fall, reputations would burn. Those who had hidden behind silence would be dragged into the light, their secrets laid bare. Justice, in its purest form, was merciless. But silence meant letting the rot fester beneath the surface. It meant letting men like Cavendish, men like Stratton, weave their shadows deeper into the city's fabric. It meant allowing the cycle to continue, unchecked, unchallenged. Her thoughts drifted to the faces of those she had encountered in the past week, the cabaret singer, whose brittle smile masked years of quiet fear, the bartender, whose hands never quite stopped shaking when the wrong name was spoken, the manager, whose desperation had been both his shield and his downfall, and Lon, the district attorney, who had built his own survival on a foundation of silence. Each of them had made choices, some to protect themselves, some to preserve what little power they had left, some because they simply had no other way to survive. In the end, they were all trapped, bound by the very corruption they had tried to control. But justice wasn't about who survived the longest, it was about who was willing to end the game. As the first streetcars rattled down Maple Street, Agatha rose, the weight of the ledger pressing against her palms. She had made her decision. The guilty would not be shielded. The cycle of silence would not continue. Her steps were steady as she made her way through the quiet streets, weaving past closed storefronts and shuttered businesses, until she reached a small unassuming office, nestled in the side alley. The door creaked as she entered. Behind a cluttered desk, a man sat, his fingers ink-stained, his weary eyes sharp. A journalist, not the kind that fed the machine, but the kind that tore it apart. Agatha placed the ledger before him. "Tell the story," she said, her voice unwavering. "Make sure they see it." He hesitated only a moment before nodding. "By tonight," he promised, his gaze flickering to the book. "It'll be everywhere." Agatha turned without another word, stepping back onto the street, just as the city began to wake. The sun had risen higher now, casting long shadows across the pavement, but Maple Street had changed. It would never be the same again. She let herself glance back once, taking in the familiar buildings, the facades that had hidden so much decay for so long. The people here would pretend, for a time, that nothing had happened. They would go about their lives, sipping coffee at street corners, opening their shops, turning the pages of their evening paper, without realizing that the ink between their fingers was soaked in blood. But she knew, and soon they would too. The truth was coming, and Maple Street had no choice but to face it.